Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of how to make a full tang knife. So after the end of this tutorial, you should have a finished knife like this. The knife blade's sanded up to 600 grit, and I've sanded all the firework and all of the handle as well up to 600 grit. This wood's sanded up to 400 grit, and so are the pins. And the wood that I used here is some oak wood, some mystery hardwood, which I'm not sure what it is, and some acacia wood here and on this side. So now let's continue to see how to make the knife. So now I'm just going to be drilling the holes in the handles for the pins to go through, which are going to hold the knife handle in place. And you need to do this before you heat treat the knife, because if you do it after you've heat treated the knife, the steel is going to be really hard and it will take forever for you to drill through it. This drill press drills much more quickly than just using a normal hand drill, because you can apply much more vertical pressure, and also it means that the holes are completely vertical. But if you do only have a hand drill, you can just use that. Also, if you drill at a slower speed, you'll be able to drill through the metal quicker if you put your drill on a much slower speed. And then whenever the drill bit gets clogged up with bits of metal, if you put on some oil to help lubricate the drill. Start by just drilling pilot holes with a really small thin drill bit so that I can drill the holes much easier. And then once I've drilled all of the holes with the small drill bit, I then move on to a drill bit that's the same size as the pins which I'm going to be using. So once I've drilled the holes using a drill press, the pins which I'm using for the handle can fit right through like this, and they fit in really snugly, and they're not going to be wobbling about when they're in the handle. These pins which I'm using are just going to be thick steel nails. Now the blade's ready to be heat treated. Right, so I've got all the equipment that I need for heat treating set up here, and I'm just going to show you what you need. So first you need some thick leather gloves that are fire resistant or fireproof, and they're important so you don't burn your hands. Then you need some safety glasses, and obviously you need the knife, and then you need some pliers to be handling the knife once you've heated it up. You also need a magnet, and I've just put the magnet in some more grip pliers, because once you've heated the knife up in your forge until it's red hot, it'll become non-magnetic, and when it's non-magnetic, it won't stick to the magnet in the handle anymore, and that's when you're going to quench it. And what I'm going to be quenching it in is this motor oil in this tin can here, and as you can see, the whole of the knife blade can easily be submerged into the oil, and you can use most types of oil, but I find that motor oil works best. One of the most important things which you're going to need is going to be a forge. This is just a small forge which I made, and it only took me about half an hour to make, and really limited resources, and it's a coal powered forge with air that feeds in from this pipe here, and I've got a full tutorial on how to make this forge on my channel, so there'll be a link in the description to that video. And as you can see here, I've just got a slot cut in this forge because it's made for heat treating just small knives like this, and I can just put the blade in like this, and when I'm heat treating the knife, I'm going to be heat treating it from the spine of the blade. So I'm going to be putting it in like this, because if you heat treat it from the front of the blade, it can sometimes melt the fine edge of the blade, and you don't want that to happen. So now let's light the forge and start heating up the knife. So first I just light the forge with wood, and then I add a lot of charcoal or coal, and then I let that burn for a while with the fan on the bottom so that it'll burn really hot before I put the knife in. And then when I put the knife in, I make sure that I do it with the blade facing up and the back of the knife facing down. So now I'm just going to take the knife out of the forge, and as you can see, it's red hot and it's completely non-magnetic. Now I'm just going to plunge it in like this into the motor oil, and just do it backwards and forwards like this in the motor oil, and just be careful because the motor oil does catch fire. So now just leave the knife in the motor oil until it's cooled enough so that you can lift it out. So now I'm just going to take the knife out of the motor oil, and it's cooled down quite a lot, but just to be sure, I'm just going to put it into some water. So this is what the knife looks like once I take it out, and as you can see, it's all covered in horrible layers of carbon and oxide and slag and bits of oil. but it's also really, really brittle. So if I were to drop this onto a hard stone surface, it would just shatter like glass. So I need to be really careful with it. So now I'm just going to quickly wash off all of this dirt and slag. Right, so now the knife is all cooled down and I've cleaned off most of the oil and all of the horrible sticky slag and everything. I'm just going to do the file test on the knife, and if you don't know what that is, it's basically where you just get a normal metal file and then you rub it against the blade of the knife, and if you're able to scratch the steel, which as you can see I'm not here, the file blade strokes are doing absolutely nothing to the actual blade of the knife, then that means that the knife isn't hard enough and you need to go back and do the heat treating process again until you're not able to scratch the steel. So now that the knife is heat treated really well and it's really hard, it's also really, really brittle though, so if I dropped it on the ground here it would just shatter into a million pieces. So I need to temper it because at the moment it's completely unusable and the blade would just crack or break under the pressure of using it to carve any wood or anything like that. So to temper it, I'm just going to put it in the oven at 200 degrees Celsius. I'm going to leave it in the oven for 2 hours and then I'm going to take it out and let it naturally cool. Different knives or different knife steels require different tempering temperatures, and most of them you can achieve in an oven, but if you can't, then you can probably achieve them in something else. And if you're using different type of steel, there's a link in the description of this video to a good website that shows you a graph of all of the different types of steel and the different heats which they need. So the knife has been completely tempered now, and I just left it in the oven for 2 hours at 200 degrees Celsius, and that has softened it up enough that it's now a usable knife. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to polish all of the carbon and everything off the back of the blade, and this part of the blade, and then this side of the blade. So again, just like polishing up the knife before heat treating, I'm going to start with a low grit, but I'm going to start with 120 grit, and then I'll move my way all the way up to 400 grit, and I'm actually going to move my way all the way up to 600 grit now because this is the final polish of the knife. I'm also going to polish all the way up to 600 grit on the spine of the knife and all the way around the handle. But I'm not going to be polishing the little indents which I carved in the file work because I think that the black makes you be able to see it more. So what I've done now is I've just polished up all of the back of the blade like this and all of the handle, and also as you can see here, what I did was I just used some 120 grit sandpaper just to file off all of the oxide, and then underneath the oxide there's just this really cool pattern which I always like to keep on my knives because I think it looks really, really cool, and I think it looks much cooler than just the normal bare steel, and that's sanded up to 120 grit. But because the steel is much, much harder now, 120 grit makes much less deep scratches in the steel, so 120 grit is like a much, much higher grit. So now I'm going to sand it all the way up to 400 grit just on the blade. So now I've polished the whole blade all the way up to 600 grit because I actually went past 400 grit because you could still see some of the scratches in it, and I even polished the back of it. Also, as you can see here, with all of these parts of the firework which are dumpled in, I haven't cleared off any of the black oxide which was left on there because I think it means that you can see the wavy line that I carved into the metal much, much better. Now it's time to start thinking about attaching the handle. Okay, so for the knife handle, what I'm basically going to be using is some of this nice solid oak wood which I've got here because I really like the grain on it, and just some of this mystery hardwood which I'm not quite sure what it is. And these two bits are going to be like this, and then they're going to be stuck onto the knife like this. So now I need to place my knife over the piece of wood which I'm going to be using for the handle scales, and then I'm just going to be using my drill press with a 3.5mm drill bit that's the same diameter as the pin which I'm using to just drill holes all the way through the scale handles of the knife and then out the other side, and then I'm going to do that for all of the holes on the wood. So this is what the wood looks like once I've put all of the pins through it, and as you can see they go all the way through the steel. So as you can see here, what I've gone and done is I've got the knife clamped up in the vise and with two mole grip pliers holding the wood on in the right places, and I've put the pins through the hole while the glue was still drying, and then I've pulled them out so that they don't get stuck in. And the glue which I've used is a 2-part epoxy called epoxy resin or araldite, and this glue is really good at attaching wood and metal together. And I roughed up the surfaces with some 80 grit sandpaper so that the glue would bond better, and all of these holes are completely lined up perfectly, and that's really important so you can get the pins back in afterwards. So the glue is set on the knife, and as you can see I've just used rasps and saws to get it down to the flat shape of the blade, but unfortunately over here this bit cracked off, so I'm just going to glue a piece of another wood onto here. So for the wood on the other side of the handle, I'm just going to be using some acacia hardwood, and I'm also going to use a small piece of it just to fill up this little gap here. Usually I make the handles of my knives symmetrical, but I've decided for this one I'm just going to make them completely different. So for making the handle, the first thing which I need to do is just roll around the knife onto the wood. Now I need to cut this out. So I've cut the acacia wood really thin and it's all cut out now, so I'm just going to glue it on with more epoxy resin just onto the knife like this. Roughen the smooth polished surface before you apply the glue. So I've put on the glue and now I've clamped it up.
Okay, so now the glue has set, and I'm just going to be using rasps to file down the wood so that it is flat with the metal. And I'm also going to be careful not to put any deep scratches into the metal when I'm using the rasps, because I spent ages polishing the back of the metal up.
So now as you can see I've just rasped everything down into the basic shape so that it's flat with all of the knife steel like this. So now I'm just going to get a normal hand drill and drill all the way through all of these holes and out the other side so that I can put the pins through. So this is what it looks like with all of the pins through it. Now I'm going to start to shape the handle so that it feels nice in my hands.
So for shaping the handle, I always start with just a rasp and start curving all of the corners, and also the piece where the knife blade goes onto where the wood starts, you need to also make sure that you curve that so that it slowly tapers away from the wood into the knife blade.
So this is what the knife blade looks like once I've rounded all of the edges of the handle with rasps. And as you can see, the three different types of wood here look really nice, and I think they're going to have a really nice contrast once I oil them up. Now I'm going to glue in these pins with more epoxy resin, and then I'm going to cut them off and file them flat against the wood.
So for cutting off and filing down the pins, I'm just using a normal metal rasp, and I just cut it off on each side and then file it so that it's flush with the wood.
So this is what the knife looks like once I've put the pins all the way through the handle, and now as you can see I've got most of the deep scratches out of the rasp where I was putting the pins through, but I now need to go along with the file and get all of the deep scratches out the back part.
So for getting all the deep scratches out, I'm just using a half round metal file, and then when I get close to the metal I'm just using some 120 grit sandpaper. So once I've got all of the deep scratches out with the file, then I move on to using just the 120 grit sandpaper just on the normal wood, and I need to take special care to use it especially on where the pins are going through because they're metal and they take longer to file all of the scratches out. Then once I've got done with 120 grit sandpaper, I'm going to move my way all the way up to 400 grit.
So this is what the handle looks like once I've sanded it all the way up to 400 grit. As you can see, the oak here goes all the way down here, and then it's got a really nice contrast to this mystery wood, which I'm not quite sure what it is, and then back to the acacia, and then all of this acacia wood will look really nice once I've oiled it. So now it's time to oil it. I'm just going to oil it with some sunflower oil. You can use pretty much whatever oil you want, but I've also heard that linseed oil works well.
So just apply whichever oil you're using evenly with a thick coating over the wood, and then leave it to soak in.
So this is what the handle looks like once I've oiled it, and I think that it looks really nice. I'm now going to wait for the oil to dry, and then I'm going to apply another layer, and then I'm going to apply 3 layers of polyurethane varnish. Okay, so the knife is finished now, and I've applied 3 layers of polyurethane varnish and also another layer of oil underneath the varnish, and that means that this knife is completely waterproof and it's also completely scratch proof. Now all I need to do is sharpen the blade on a whetstone and then see if it's sharp enough. I won't show how to sharpen the blade in this video because there's thousands of videos on YouTube of how to sharpen knives much better than what I do. So this is what the knife looks like once it's finished, and I've sharpened it up. I've decided not to acid etch anything in the top of the knife just because the blade's quite small and I think that it wouldn't look very good on this knife. If you want to see a tutorial of how to acid etch metal like The Art of Weapons like I did here, then click on the link in the description down below. Also, if you want to know how to make a wooden sheath like this with magnets in the handle, I'll be having a tutorial up next week to show you how. So stay tuned and see the link in the description down below for once I've uploaded that video. So now that this knife's already sharp, it's time to do the paper test. The paper test is basically you put the knife against the paper and then you try and cut the paper, and if the knife cuts the paper easily and makes a really smooth, clean cut, then your knife is really sharp. And look at that. So thanks for watching, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please hit the like button down below and subscribe. Also send me a personal message or post a comment down below saying what weapon you'd like me to make next.